I still remember the sound more than anything else. Not the arguments, not the angry phone calls, not even the smug grin on the HOA president's face. What stuck with me was the slow metallic groan of the first fence post being pulled straight out of the ground, while half the neighborhood stood there pretending they were enjoying the show. 43 minutes. That's how long it took for every inch of the fence they forced onto my property to disappear. The funny part is, none of that would have happened if they had simply listened the first time I said, "Hey, I think your fence is on my land. My name's Ethan Walker." And until all this happened, I was probably the most forgettable neighbor in Brookstone Ridge. I wasn't the guy throwing loud parties. I wasn't the one filing complaints over someone's trash cans. And I definitely wasn't looking for a fight with the HOA. I worked as a commercial HVAC technician, spent most weekends fixing things around the house. And if I had free time, you could usually find me outside growing tomatoes that somehow never tasted as good as the ones my grandfather used to grow back in Kentucky. When I bought the house in 2019, one of the reasons I picked it was the backyard. It wasn't huge, but it backed up against a wooded greenbelt that made the whole place feel peaceful. There was enough room for a raised garden, a little fire pit, and an old maple tree that dropped leaves everywhere every fall but somehow made the yard feel complete. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Parker, used to joke that I'd spend more time talking to that tree than to actual people. She wasn't entirely wrong. Back then, the HOA mostly existed on paper. You paid your dues, kept your grass trimmed, and every now and then you get an email reminding everyone not to leave Christmas lights up until Easter. Nobody cared much because nobody made it their full-time job to care. Then everything changed after the annual board election. A man named Randall Pierce became president. Randall was one of those people who walked like he expected doors to open before he reached them, always tucked in polo shirts, expensive sunglasses even on cloudy days, and a habit of saying things like, "I'm just protecting property values," whenever someone questioned him. The first few months didn't seem too bad. He organized landscaping projects, replaced old entrance signs, even arranged food trucks one Friday evening. People actually liked him. Looking back now, I think that was the dangerous part. When someone wants control, they rarely start by acting controlling. They start by being useful. Little by little, Randall convinced the board that the western edge of the neighborhood needed a brand new privacy fence. According to him, it would improve security, reduce noise from the county road beyond the trees, and make the subdivision look more upscale. It sounded reasonable enough. The problem was, nobody whose backyard actually bordered that greenbelt was ever invited to discuss where that fence would go. There wasn't a survey presentation. There wasn't a homeowner meeting. There wasn't even a knock on my front door. On a Tuesday morning, I left for work before sunrise like I always did. My phone stayed buried in my toolbox most of the day because we were replacing rooftop units at a shopping center across town. Around lunch, Mrs. Parker tried calling twice. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that simply said, "Honey, you might want to come home a little early if you can." By the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, I knew something was wrong before I even got out of my truck. There were fresh tire tracks across the edge of my lawn. My flower bed had been flattened by construction equipment, and standing across the back of my property was a brand new 6-foot cedar privacy fence that absolutely had not been there when I left that morning. At first, I actually thought they built it for me. Then I walked closer. My stomach dropped. The fence wasn't sitting on the old boundary markers. It cut directly across one corner of my vegetable garden. 3 tomato plants had been ripped out. My irrigation line had been sliced clean through. Even worse, I recognized one of the iron survey pins I'd seen when I bought the property. It was sitting several inches on my side of the new fence. I crouched down, brushed the dirt away with my hand, and just stared at it. Maybe I was tired, I told myself. Maybe I remembered wrong. I went inside, dug through the folder that had every closing document from when I purchased the house, and spread the survey across my kitchen table. I measured twice. Then I measured again. The numbers didn't change. The fence wasn't close to my property line. It was well inside it. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Surely this had to be a mistake. No contractor would intentionally build an entire fence onto someone else's land, right? So, I did what any reasonable person would do. I picked up my phone and called Randall. He answered on the second ring with the kind of relaxed confidence that immediately made me feel like he already knew why I was calling. "Evening, Ethan," he said. "Everything looking good?" I looked out my kitchen window toward the fence before answering. Actually, no. I think your crew put that fence on my property. There was a short pause, followed by a quiet chuckle. Our contractor measured everything. I'm sure it's exactly where it's supposed to be. I have the original survey sitting in front of me. Those old surveys aren't always accurate. Then send me yours. Another pause. Longer this time. Then his voice got colder. It looks right to me. Don't overthink it. Just let it go. The line went dead before I could answer, and standing there in my own kitchen, looking out at a fence that had stolen a piece of my backyard, I realized something that would shape everything that happened afterward. This wasn't a construction mistake. Someone had already decided my property line didn't matter. The next morning, I walked back out there with the tape measure, a can of orange marking paint, and the survey I'd kept folded in that same closing folder for years. Mrs. Parker wandered over carrying her coffee mug before I'd even finished measuring. She looked from the fence to the survey in my hand and quietly asked, "It's really on your property, isn't it?" I nodded. "By more than a foot." She let out a slow whistle. "Well, that's going to make for an interesting board meeting." I laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. I still believed this could be fixed with one honest conversation. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I wasn't looking for a lawsuit. I just wanted my backyard back. That afternoon, I emailed Randall politely, attaching a copy of my original survey and asking if the board would be willing to pause construction until an independent surveyor could verify the boundary. I even wrote, "If I'm wrong, I'll gladly apologize." Looking back, I almost regret giving them that much grace because they treated it like weakness. 3 days passed. Nothing. No email. No phone call. No acknowledgement that I'd even written. A week later, I mailed a certified letter to the HOA office requesting a formal review. When the return receipt came back signed, I thought, finally, now somebody has to respond. Nobody did. Instead, something stranger started happening. One Saturday morning, I found 2 board members standing in the common area behind my yard, looking at the fence and pointing toward my garden. When they noticed me watching, they walked away without saying a word. Another neighbor later told me Randall had been telling people I was confused about where my property ended and that I was trying to claim HOA land. That bothered me more than I expected. It wasn't just the fence anymore. It was the idea that if someone repeated a lie confidently enough, people might actually believe it. So I stopped relying on opinions and started collecting facts. I hired a licensed land surveyor named Daniel Mercer, a guy who had been surveying property lines across the county for almost 30 years. He showed up in an old white pickup with more equipment than I knew existed: GPS receivers, total stations, tripods, metal detectors. It looked like he was preparing for a moon landing instead of measuring his suburban backyard. While he worked, he explained every step. He located the original iron monuments buried beneath the soil, compared them with county plats, checked historic subdivision records, and even pulled archive coordinates from when Brookstone Ridge had first been developed. Around lunchtime, he looked up from his equipment, smiled the kind of smile that only comes from absolute certainty, and said, "Well, you're not crazy." I laughed. "That's good to hear." He pointed directly at the fence. "It's approximately 14 inches inside your property for the entire length. Whoever laid this out never verified the monuments." Hearing someone else say it out loud changed everything. Until then, I'd been hoping I was wrong, because being wrong would have been cheaper and easier. Instead, I was standing there with professional proof that someone had taken a strip of my land and expected me to quietly live with it forever. Daniel's final report was thorough, complete with photographs, certified measurements, diagrams, and enough technical language to make it painfully clear there wasn't any room for interpretation. I immediately forwarded the report to the HOA board along with another letter. This time my tone changed. I wasn't asking any more. I informed them that the fence encroached onto private property, requested that they remove it voluntarily, and gave them 21 days before I pursued legal remedies. I also copied the county building department after discovering something that surprised even my attorney later on. There was no permit for the fence. None. Whoever approved the project had skipped one of the most basic legal requirements. Suddenly, this wasn't simply a boundary dispute. It involved an unpermitted structure crossing onto private land. A few days later, I finally got a phone call from Randall. His voice carried that same confident edge I'd heard before, except this time it sounded slightly forced. "You're making this a much bigger issue than it needs to be, Ethan." "No," I answered calmly. "I'm asking you to move a fence off my property." He sighed dramatically. "It's 14 inches. It's my 14 inches. Silence. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. You're willing to spend thousands of dollars fighting over 14 inches? I looked out my back window while he spoke. I'm willing to protect what I paid for. You'll lose. Then let a judge tell me that. He hung up again. That conversation stayed with me because it revealed something important. Randall honestly believed nobody would ever spend the time or money necessary to challenge him. He'd confused patience with surrender. Over the next 3 weeks, nothing changed. The fence stayed exactly where it was. The board ignored every deadline. At the monthly HOA meeting I attended with copies of Daniel's survey under my arm, when homeowner comments opened, I calmly explained the situation and offered copies of the report to every board member. Randall barely looked at them. Our contractor already measured everything, he said into the microphone. This matter is closed. I asked one simple question. Can you show everyone those measurements? The room became so quiet I could hear someone stirring ice in a plastic cup near the back wall. Randall shuffled a few papers, avoided eye contact, and finally replied, "They're not necessary." Several homeowners exchanged confused looks. One older gentleman actually raised his hand and asked why the board wouldn't compare 2 surveys if they were so confident. Randall immediately moved to the next agenda item. Walking out of that meeting, Mrs. Parker caught up with me in the parking lot. "Honey," she whispered, "I think he just made the biggest mistake of his life." I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in closure. But by the time the 21st day expired without so much as a single email from the HOA, something inside me had changed. I'd given them every reasonable opportunity to fix their mistake privately. I documented everything. I'd remained respectful. I'd waited. They mistook every act of patience for weakness, and that misunderstanding was about to become incredibly expensive. The following Monday morning, I walked into the office of attorney Rebecca Collins carrying a folder nearly 3 inches thick. She flipped through the surveys, photographs, certified letters, county records, email printouts, and permit search results without saying much for several minutes. Finally, she closed the folder, leaned back in her chair, smiled, and said the 6 words that completely changed the direction of this story. "Let's go get your backyard back." Rebecca wasn't interested in making speeches or dragging things out. She looked me straight in the eye and said, "Judges love reasonable people, Ethan, and you've been more than reasonable." Over the next 2 weeks, she filed everything with the court. Every certified letter, every unanswered email, Daniel Mercer's survey, the county's confirmation that no permit had ever been issued, and dozens of photographs documenting exactly where the fence sat. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that the encroachment was minor and that removing the fence would place an unnecessary financial burden on the association. Rebecca simply slid my survey across the table and replied, "Private property doesn't become public because removing the mistake cost money." The hearing itself lasted less than an hour. The judge asked Randall one question that seemed to drain every ounce of competence out of him. Did the association commission an independent survey after receiving written notice from the homeowner? Randall shifted in his seat before quietly answering, "No, Your Honor." "Did the association obtain a building permit before construction?" Another pause. "No." The judge nodded once, looked down at the documents in front of him, and I could almost tell the decision had already been made. A week later, the order arrived. The HOA was directed to remove every portion of the fence that crossed onto my property, restore the affected area, commission a complete boundary survey for the entire western section of the subdivision, obtain proper permits before rebuilding, and reimburse my surveying fees, legal expenses, and court costs. The total came to just over $6,400, all paid from HOA reserve funds. Rebecca called me that afternoon. "Congratulations," she said. "Now let's make sure they actually comply." We could have waited for the HOA to organize its own contractor, but after weeks of delays and excuses, the court authorized me to arrange removal if they failed to act within the specified deadline. They missed that deadline too. Not by much, just enough to prove they still believed the rules somehow applied to everyone except them. So I hired a local excavation company owned by a man named Travis Boone. When I explained the situation, he chuckled and said, "You telling me a judge gave you permission to pull out somebody else's fence?" "The part that's sitting on my land," I answered. "That's the only part I care about." He laughed again. "I'll have a machine there Thursday morning." I barely slept the night before. It wasn't because I was nervous about the legal side anymore. That part was over. It was because I knew what the next morning would look like. Neighbors would notice. Curtains would move. Garage doors would mysteriously open. Brookstone Ridge hadn't seen real drama in years, and by 8 o'clock that Thursday morning, There were already people walking dogs that suddenly needed much longer walks than usual. Travis climbed out of his truck wearing a faded baseball cap and looked over the fence. "Well," he said with a grin, "that thing isn't going to remove itself." His operator started the compact backhoe while another worker carefully checked the survey stakes Daniel had placed weeks earlier. I appreciated that. Even now, after everything, they wanted to be absolutely certain every movement stayed within the court order. Then, almost on cue, Randall stepped out of his house 3 doors away. He wasn't wearing one of his polished polo shirts this time, just jeans and a wrinkled sweatshirt, but he still carried himself like he expected everyone to stop what they were doing the moment he appeared. He marched across the grass toward us. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Travis looked at me instead of answering. "Your property," he said quietly. "Your call." I reached into my folder, pulled out the signed court order, and handed it to Randall. He barely glanced at the first page before shoving it back toward me. "This is ridiculous." "No," I said calmly. "This is what happens when someone ignores 21 days' worth of chances." His face turned bright red. "You'll regret embarrassing this association." I couldn't help smiling. "I never embarrassed the association." "Randall, you did that yourself." Travis tipped his head toward the operator. "Go ahead." The hydraulic arm eased forward, wrapped around the first post, and with one slow pull, the timber came free from the ground, roots of fresh concrete breaking apart beneath it. The sound echoed across the backyards like a heavy tree cracking during a storm. Nobody said a word. Another post came out, then another. Panel after panel disappeared into the trailer. Mrs. Parker stood on her patio trying very hard not to smile. Though she wasn't fooling anyone. A couple across the street quietly applauded after the fifth section came down before realizing everyone could hear them. 43 minutes later, the last section resting on my property was gone. My backyard looked strangely open again, scarred in places where the equipment had crossed. But somehow it already felt like mine again. Randall never spoke another word. He simply turned around and walked back toward his house while every neighbor watched him leave. A few months later, the HOA hired a licensed surveying company, rebuilt the fence exactly where it should have been from the beginning, and quietly adopted a new policy requiring independent surveys before any construction affecting homeowner boundaries. Funny how expensive lessons tend to become permanent policies. Randall finished his term but never ran for re-election. Whether he was voted out because of the money, the embarrassment, or simply because people finally stopped believing everything he said, I'll never know. What I do know is this: property lines aren't opinions. They aren't suggestions. And they definitely aren't something an HOA gets to redraw because it feels convenient. Looking back, I don't think the biggest victory was getting those 14 inches of land back. It was proving that staying calm doesn't mean giving up. That documenting the truth can be more powerful than shouting. And that sometimes the strongest response is simply refusing to move when you know you're standing on what's legally yours. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my shoes, would you have called an attorney after the very first ignored letter? Or would you have given the HOA every chance to fix its own mistake like I did? Let me know down in the comments because I've seen people argue both sides of this. And honestly, I'd love to hear where you stand. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or anyone who thought they could take advantage of you until the facts caught up with them, share your story too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real neighborhood justice stories, and I'll see you in the next one.